the United States is in a crisis. And it forces us all to have a conversation about liberalism and illiberalism, right? In academia for the past 4 years, really since Trump got elected, there has been a conversation about illiberalism, right? And basically mainstream political science is warning everyone that illiberalism is on the rise. What is illiberalism? Illiberalism is one of those words that does not really have a meaning. It's just a negative, right? What is an atheist? It's one without theism. It's one who does not believe in God. Atheism itself is not a thing. It is the absence of a thing, right? There is no religion called atheism. There is theism, which is the belief in a God, a deity, and there is atheism, being without such a thing. Illiberalism is simply a rejection of liberalism. And so if we're going to discuss the rise of illiberalism in the world and how that relates to the Super Bowl ad for the Church of Scientology, which I will get to, we're going to have to define what liberalism is. And there's a lot of, in the United States, the way people generally describe politics, there are liberals and there are conservatives. Democrats are liberals. Conservatives are Republicans. And that is politics, right? And anything left-wing we think of as being liberal. And if someone is a communist, they are an ultra-liberal. And if someone is a fascist or a Nazi, they are an ultra-conservative. This is a very, 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 very primitive understanding of politics. This is cable news stuff. This is Fox and MSNBC and CNN. It is so much more complicated than that. And if you're going to understand what liberalism actually is, and why we're seeing a rise of what you can call illiberalism, you're going to have to get beyond these Fox News, Chris Matthews, Sean Hannity, Tucker Carlson definitions of things. What is liberalism? Liberalism is a school of thought that comes out of the European period known as the Enlightenment. Liberalism is the belief in the individual. That's really what liberalism is. Liberalism is the belief in the individual and the rejection of society and their ability to control the individual. That's all that liberalism is. Liberalism is life, liberty, and property, John Locke. Liberalism is liberté, égalité, fraternité in the French Revolution. Liberalism is life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and Thomas Jefferson. That's what liberalism is. Liberalism is a school of thought that originated with the capitalist revolutions to overturn feudalism. As the capitalists of Europe were overthrowing the nobles and kings, they were uprooting the system of feudalism. They replaced the mystical beliefs of the Roman Catholic Church and the feudal order with liberalism, which was the idea of quote-unquote individual rights. And Karl Marx spent a huge amount of time in the Communist Manifesto writing about liberalism. And Marx wrote a lot about liberalism. In fact, the first section of the Communist Manifesto, the bourgeois and proletarians, that section, is all about liberalism, how it strips from its halo every profession held upon with reverent awe, reduces the priest and the poet and the man of science to page laborers, right? It creates no nexus remaining between man and man, but but naked self-interest and callous cash payment, right? It forces the world on pains of extinction to become bourgeois themselves and to create the world in its own image. And he talks about how the bourgeoisie and capitalism played the most revolutionary role. And all throughout the feudal world, in the feudal system, where you have landowners, people who own land, And you have serfs, people who work on the land and are considered kind of semi-slaves of the landowners. They have their little tract and they work it and they pay their taxes to the landlord, and they get to keep what's left over, and they're not allowed to really leave. That in order to hold that system up, there were a whole lot of very, very hierarchical rules that had been established. There was the Roman Catholic Church, and if you spoke against the Roman Catholic Church, that was called heresy. And you got burned at the stake. You weren't allowed to disagree with the Roman Catholic Church, or else you were burned at the stake. Right? One was required to say and believe what the Roman Catholic order said in order to keep the feudal system intact. And the peasantry and the serfs were exploited brutally by the landowners, and there was no real progress that was allowed. There were some skilled trades. You had blacksmiths. You had people that did different things like weaving clothes and things like that. There were certain skilled trades, but overall, the overwhelming majority of society was either a peasant or a landowner. You had soldiers who kept everyone in line. You had a state that worked for the landowners to keep people in line. You had a king who was above the landowners and kind of, kept the landowners in line and was above them. And that was how society worked. And there were all kinds of elaborate mystical rituals established in order to keep this very, very hierarchical system intact. That there were different ways of addressing people. If you spoke to somebody in the feudal order who was higher than you couldn't use the same words, right? They might refer to you as thee, but you could refer to them as you, right? I mean, there were all these really, really authoritarian rules just about how people could interact with each other. You talk about bowing, right? You talk about, groveling, there was all these elaborate rules to keep a very, very elaborate hierarchical system intact. That was feudalism. And capitalism, as Karl Marx talks about in his Communist Manifesto, ripped it to shreds, and rightly so, absolutely rightly so. The peasants had no rights. The peasants were brutally exploited, and feudalism was holding back technology, right? The guilds, the way the guilds were set up, the blacksmith could not improve the way he made his metal. It was against the rules. They were all, the way the guilds were set up in feudalism, no historical progress was allowed. And so ripping apart feudalism and allowing factory owners to create factories and allowing, international trade and allowing, banks to be established and allowing, cities to spring up. And this was all historically necessary. It was a good thing that feudalism was ripped apart by capitalism. If we had remained in feudalism, we would never have raised the productive forces. The human life expectancy would still be very, very low. There wouldn't be all the great inventions that we have. There wouldn't be human progress, right? That ripping up feudalism, breaking apart feudalism was historically necessary, and it was a good thing to do. And in order to rip it up, you needed liberalism, right? In feudalism, the understanding is that you have no right to yourself. You fit into this very, very complicated social hierarchy. You have no human rights. If you got up in a feudal society and said, well, I disagree with the Catholic Church because of my human right to freedom of religion, they would have said, you are completely insane. You didn't have the right to freedom of religion. You didn't have the right to freedom of speech. You didn't have the right to live your life the way you wanted to. You didn't have the right to make your own decisions. Everyone was assigned a place by society, and you had to fulfill that. Historical progress was not allowed. Technological innovation was pretty much not allowed. Social mobility was certainly not allowed. Everyone was assigned a place at birth. They did what they were supposed to do. They thought what they were supposed to think, and that was that. Now, every so often, every 100 years or so, there would be uprisings in feudalism. This is something a lot of people don't realize, especially a lot of the far right-wing folks who like to glorify feudalism. They pretend that everyone was just always happy with it. I have not read that book. They always pretend that everyone was just totally happy with feudalism. That's not the case. There were uprisings very frequently against feudalism. In fact, there was almost a cycle in feudalism, that every 100 years or so, the peasants would rise up and revolt against feudalism. There was Thomas Munzer and the peasant wars of Germany. In China, they had the Taiping Uprising. And usually these revolts had an oddly religious and oddly apocalyptic character. In Europe, they referred to the cycle as millenarianism, and that around every 100 years or so, people would think that the world was coming to an end. Peasants would start whipping and flogging themselves. They would start thinking that they were going to build God's kingdom on earth. They would rise up and kill the landlords. There would be ugly civil wars between the peasants rising up and killing the landlords and the feudal order trying to restore things. And after the millenarian period was over, feudalism would be restored. And this was a natural cycle. You would have peasant uprisings happening throughout feudalism. And in China, they had feudalism for thousands of years, and it was considered part of the cycle that every little while, every 100 years or so, there would be a big, huge peasant uprising. And every so often, there would be a social explosion under feudalism, but it wouldn't go anywhere. Eventually, feudalism would be restored, and everything would go back to the normal of feudalism. That is, until there was enough of a technological breakthrough to change that. It was when Marco Polo and the Silk Road started bringing in new products, and technology. It was when a new class of merchants, they were neither peasants nor landlords, they were mercantile capitalists. They traveled from land to land selling things. It wasn't until there was a material basis that you could really bring down feudalism. Until then, these revolts were just kind of considered part of the built-in natural cycle of feudal society. Anyway, so liberalism is the ideology that tore apart feudalism, the rights of man. And nowadays, we live in a world, at least in the West, in Britain, the United States, Western Europe, liberalism is the ruling ideology. And there are three forms of liberalism. First, there is economic liberalism. This is where the term neoliberalism comes in. They call it market liberalism. And this is the idea that the economy should be left to its own devices. The government should not run the economy. Under feudalism, the idea was the government, the king ordered, you to build a bridge, you built the bridge. The king ordered you to grow corn, you grew corn. Well, market liberalism says the owners of property, the capitalists, can do whatever they want. They can do whatever they want. They can make profits. And a whole ideology has been developed around this, right? You talk about classical liberalism and economy. You talk about neoliberalism and Milton Friedman. It's the idea that hey, government should not be involved. There should not be any coercion upon the economy. The state has no right, to interfere with the market, right? That it is up to every individual capitalist how he wants to run his property. He has private property rights, right? That those oil wells that he owns are his private property. So the government cannot tell him how much oil to extract or how much oil to sell because it is his private property. Factory, where the capitalist hires a bunch of workers, that is his private property. And the government doesn't have the right to tell him how much he can pay his workers or how he should treat them because that's his private property. Hands off. This is economic liberalism. Then you have what's called social liberalism. And I agree, pretty much with social liberalism. Social liberalism is the idea that you can live your life however you want to live your own life, so long as you don't violate the rights of somebody else, right? The old feudal society, everyone was obligated to get married by a certain age, obligated to have children, well, not the case anymore, right? Now, you want to get married? You don't want to get married. That's fine, right? You are gay or lesbian, that's your business, right? That your life is your business, Social liberalism goes a little bit further. It says if you want to use drugs, that's your business, not the government's business, right? I agree with that. I don't think people should be thrown in jail for using drugs, right? You want to use drugs, that's your business. You want to get married, there's no compulsion for you to live your life in a social way according to anybody else. It's up to you how to live your life. That's social liberalism. Now, let me add that in the last 50, 60 years, we've seen the rise of what you can call ideological liberalism. Ideological liberalism. And ideological liberalism says that there is no overarching truth. Now, this is interesting, right? So far, economic liberalism is the government can't interfere with the economy. Social liberalism is no one can interfere with your life. You can live your life the way you want. Ideological liberalism goes a little bit further. It says nobody should tell you what's true and what's not. Ideological liberalism goes further, and it says no one should give you ideology. Ideology is bad. That is what philosophical liberalism says, that every order that has ever existed, feudalism, slave societies, has had an ideological narrative, right? In feudalism, they had the Roman Catholic Church telling you all about, if you're good, you go to heaven. If you're bad, you go to hell. Jesus died on the cross for your sin. Well, get rid of that, right? Communist societies are considered to be illiberal. They tell you that we're the working class. We're fighting, for the proletariat. No, got to get rid of that. Philosophical liberalism says that any attempt to give you a narrative about who you are, any attempt to explain human history with a grand narrative, that's totalitarianism. You're not allowed. You're not allowed to give people a narrative about who they are. You're not allowed to tell people where they're going. Everyone should be told that there is no definite truth. That truth is in the eye of the beholder. There are competing narratives out there, and that if someone comes along and tries to tell you that there's a truth, they are totalitarian. So postmodernism is philosophical liberalism. So we have three manifestations of liberalism. We have economic liberalism, we have social liberalism, and we have philosophical liberalism. And basically, all three of them boil down to this: individualism above all else. Your individualism, your ability to not have anyone tell you anything, your ability to be completely unmessed with, your ability and the need for you to be an atomized individual, doing your own thing, that comes above everything else. Everything else. That your individual rights, the individual right of the economic activity of the people to do whatever they want, the social right of people to do whatever they want in terms of how they live their lives, and the belief that no one should try to impose on you beliefs about how you should live your life, that takes priority. And we live right now amid the collapse of liberalism. Liberalism as an ideology is completely failing. Why? Human nature. Isn't that funny, right? Usually those defenders of capitalism is the one throwing human nature in our faces. Well, I'm going to say human nature. Human beings have always been collective creatures. Human beings, for the majority of our existence as a species, we were hunter-gatherers. We lived in tribes. All of human history has been a history of human beings working together collectively. Whenever human beings have existed, they've always been in groups with other human beings, families, tribes, communities, neighborhoods, countries. And these groups tend to develop beliefs, right? They tend to believe things together as a group, and those beliefs tend to be based on their shared experience. And around these beliefs that communities and collectives develop, they tend to come up with a list of rules. And those rules tend to be social rules, and they tend to be economic rules. And as humans create and exchange goods and services, certain economic rules are developed. As humans, live their lives, get married, have children, etc., certain social rules are developed. Those social rules and economic rules are based on philosophical rules. And human existence for the entire history of humanity has been illiberalism. No one talked about liberalism at all until about the 1400s in Europe. Never had the economic level been reached to facilitate a liberal society. And liberalism was great when it got rid of the feudal commons and the feudal estates and medieval authority. Feudalism was an oppressive system, and liberalism was good. It ripped it apart. But now we live in a time where liberalism has become unhinged. And if we look at what's happening in the Western world, and people don't have health care, the roads aren't paved, the water is not properly purified, people don't have jobs, people are hungry, poverty amidst plenty. There are all kinds of big problems created by liberalism. The pandemic is in and of itself a complete repudiation of liberalism. There is not a solution to this pandemic, to COVID-19, that can be resolved within the framework of liberalism. You are not on your own with COVID-19. You are not on your own with COVID-19. If the government had said, you know what? COVID-19, you get it, you don't get it, that's your problem. Wouldn't work. The death count would be even higher than it already is. COVID-19 was a society-wide problem, and COVID-19 is a problem that requires a society-wide solution. The way we handle healthcare in the United States is you're on your own. Right? You go buy insurance, you get insurance from your employer, you don't. That's all. That's your problem. Right? Why? I mean, remember Bill O'Reilly? He said on his program, he was angry about Obamacare. Right? Well, what if fat people eat lots of fattening foods and then my taxes go up? I don't want to have to deal with anyone else's health. Our attitude in the United States when it comes to healthcare is you're on your own. It's between you and your doctor. Right? Healthcare, the state has no obligation to give you healthcare. The state has no obligation to give you healthcare. And you have no obligation to pay taxes to the state to make sure that everyone can have health care. If you want health care, go out and get it yourself. And that's between bootstraps, as Kinky is putting it in the chat. That's our attitude about health care in the United States, right? Well, what we've learned from this pandemic is that the health of one is the health of all. The health of one is the health of all. Society has to come together to deal with COVID-19. It's a collective problem, and you have to have a collective solution. The same goes for natural disasters. Right? Look at Hurricane Katrina, how so many people were left behind. Collective problems that affect all of society require collective solutions. And if you look at other countries around the world that have developed more collective societies, China, Vietnam, Cuba, Venezuela, societies that have gotten rid of economic liberalism. They have an economy where the banks, factories, and industries are organized to serve public good and not profits. They've adopted a socialist system. Why? They've been able to respond and handle the COVID-19 pandemic more effectively. Far lower death rates. Why? Because they don't have the attitude that everyone's on their own. They don't have the attitude that, hey, it's your problem. They don't have the attitude that the individual above all else. They have a collectivist notion. And there are countries that are not socialist, mind you, that just kind of have more of a collectivist mentality that have been able to handle the pandemic much more effectively. So what in the world does this have to do? What in the world does this have to do with the Super Bowl advertisement for Scientology? Well, here's the thing. Scientology is an illiberal institution. Right? I'm not defending the Church of Scientology. I'm definitely not a Scientologist. I know they've hurt a lot of people. I've seen the same documentaries that you all have seen. I'm not a defender of the Church of Scientology whatsoever. But they are an illiberal institution. They are definitely an illiberal institution. They give their members a narrative about good and evil. They tell them right and wrong. They organize their resources in the interests of the Church of Scientology, namely the interests of the bureaucracy at the top of it. They're an illiberal and illiberal institution. And they ran an ad on the Super Bowl. If you watch the advertisements, they're trying to appeal to how much people are suffering right now. The advertisement was meant to, if you watch it, it was meant to appeal to people's desire to have help, their desire to be connected to a community. That was what the aim of the advertisement was. It was to try and reach people. And Donald Trump, many people noticed that his rhetoric and his appeal was illiberal. His policies were not illiberal. As president, he very much was all about free markets. He was economically liberal. The demagogic appeal that Donald Trump made was an illiberal appeal. He appealed to people, America first, we never lose, we always win. There was very much a demagogic, illiberal appeal to Donald Trump, that he was going to be a strong leader who was going to mobilize the population to solve the crisis. When liberalism is crashing and burning, as it is now, mainly for economic reasons, illiberal trends are going to become popular. And this is what happens in a crisis of capitalism. All of society realizes we need some dramatic action to resolve the crisis. That becomes a widespread understanding. We need dramatic solutions. And you're on your own, buddy. Sink or swim. Every atomized individual for themselves, that is not going to resolve it. And human beings, in our DNA, we do have a collectivist impulse. When we are suffering, we tend to get together in groups of other people to try and find a way out of the crisis. As we face hostile circumstances, we tend to become more and more illiberal. Illiberalism tends to rise in the face of hostile conditions. When people are suffering, they come together. They pull together to have a solution. That's just how human beings work. And right now, the United States is facing a big, big problem. It's facing very hostile circumstances. There are hungry people out there. There's instability in society. There's a pandemic. There's a lot of insecurity. So, naturally, people are going to be drawn to some or other form of illiberalism. That's just going to be the natural reality. The ruling class knows this. The whole ruling class knows this. When you have society-wide problems, when people are under siege, when people are suffering, they tend to become more and more illiberal. Yeah, when things are going well, people want to do their own thing. When things are not going well, when people are suffering and desperate, they tend to pull together and become pretty illiberal. So now we're entering this weird period where liberalism, in order to protect itself from illiberalism, is becoming illiberal. We have liberal illiberalism. It sounds like an oxymoron. It's crazy, right? According to liberalism, there should not be any censorship on YouTube. Why? You can say whatever you want. Free marketplace of ideas. Except the liberal order that insists that free marketplace of ideas is the solution has decided that in order to make sure that no one comes along to threaten the free marketplace of ideas, we need to suppress ideas that might lead to people believing you should suppress ideas. Do you see how weird this is getting? The liberal order says we can't have totalitarianism out there because that suppresses individuals. So if there's an individual who believes in totalitarianism, we need to suppress them in order to make sure that no one is going around saying we have to suppress people. Do you see how silly this is starting to get? Do you see how weird this is starting to get? No, this is, in fact, now they're having like full mobilizations of society to train people to make sure that everyone is thinking on the same page, make sure everyone's thinking alike, to make sure no one believes in a system that says people should all think alike. You know this? I mean, there are talk in Britain and in other places, they want school curriculum to teach you what websites to look at and what websites to not look at. Did you know this? They're going to train school kids in school to only trust mainstream American media because non-American media or non-mainstream media might lead you to illiberal conclusions. So we're going to brainwash children not to look at websites that might make them think that you should brainwash children. Liberalism is starting to turn into a dog chasing its own tail. It's getting really, really weird, right? With the tech censorship. Again, according to liberalism, there shouldn't be any tech censorship. But the liberals insist that tech censorship is necessary to protect liberalism. Is this making your head spin yet? Right? We're living in a period, and they all acknowledge this. Every article about the rise of illiberalism in the world acknowledges that we are living in a period where people are becoming desperate, and out of their desperation, they're getting closer together, and they're becoming more and more illiberal. And so the liberal articles in the New York Times and, all these liberal publications, Wall Street Journal, you name it, they're all talking about, because people are going to become illiberal, we need to put up barriers to make sure that people don't get information that will encourage them to become more illiberal. This is the kind of thing that should make your head want to just explode. Liberalism is supposed to believe that there should be no barriers. You should be able to think whatever you want. You should be able to read whatever you want to read. And the reason illiberals are bad, in theory, is because they might set up a society where you can't read whatever you want. You can't think whatever you want, and you can't do whatever you want economically. So we've got to make sure there are barriers to keep you from thinking illiberal thoughts so that the illiberals don't gain any strength and violate your freedom to think. This is crazy. Look, I read you all like 2 years ago now. There was an article in the Wall Street Journal by a very well-respected political science professor. And he started speaking about this trend of what he called democratic regression. He started saying that around the world there is democratic regression, right? That after the fall of the Soviet Union in the 1990s, democracy was on the march, not just in the Eastern Bloc. All those countries in the Eastern Bloc were becoming democratic, but also, Pinochet was out of power in Chile, and dictators were stepping down like Marcos, and the whole world, democracy was on the march. But now, it says, we're living in the age of illiberalism. And because of that, democracy is regressing around the world. And what two examples did he give of democratic regression? Putin in Russia and Hugo Chavez in Venezuela. And he said that both of those leaders were elected by the people, legitimately. The majority of the Venezuelans wanted Hugo Chavez. The majority of Russians wanted Vladimir Putin. But these societies were, according to this article in the Wall Street Journal, they were no longer democratic. They had regressed from democracy. And why did they regress from democracy, according to the Wall Street Journal? Well, after Vladimir Putin got elected, he proceeded to use his power as president to change the economy of Russia, and to change the military of Russia, and to change the policing agencies of Russia, and to change the media of Russia. So therefore, he tampered with these independent institutions, and so it was no longer democratic. They said the same thing about Hugo Chavez. Sure, the majority of people voted for Hugo Chavez, but once Hugo Chavez got into office, he changed the nature of the Venezuelan economy. He tampered with the independent institutions in the economy. He tampered with the independent institutions of the military. He tampered with the independent institutions of the policing agencies. He tampered with the independent institutions of the media. So therefore, Hugo Chavez got elected, and even though he was elected, because he tampered with these independent institutions, All of a sudden, Venezuela was no longer democratic, according to the Wall Street Journal. But here's the thing. These institutions in Russia or in Venezuela that were independent beforehand were serving the oligarchy. Right? In the time of Boris Yeltsin, Russia's economy was being looted left and right by British corporations and British banks and American corporations. It wasn't independent. It was serving the de facto rulers of Western capitalism. Putin got in there and he put Gazprom and Rosneft at the center of the economy. He asserted state control over the economy. So then it was no longer independent. You see, it comes from the assumption that all the institutions of society should just naturally serve the rulers of Western capitalism, right? Venezuela's state-run oil company. It was technically state-run, but everyone knew it was just a middleman for Wall Street corporations. Well, 2003, Chavez has been president for a few years. He changes the nature of the Venezuelan oil company. He changes it so the money goes into the public budget. And when he does that, it's no longer independent. It suddenly is serving the Venezuelan people. It's supposed to naturally, the oil company of Venezuela is just supposed to naturally serve Western corporations. It's independent when it serves Western corporations. When it doesn't, then it's no longer independent, and that's democratic regression, right? He changed the nature of the military. Hugo Chavez got in there, he changed the nature of the military. He said that, we're going to train our military in Cuba. We're going to have Marxism be part of the education of the military. Oh, no, you can't do that. Now it's no longer independent. Before, when they were being spoon-fed Western ideology, when they were getting trained in the United States, that was just independence. Are you starting to see how weird this is all getting? That liberalism is on the defensive. Liberalism is on the defensive. Liberalism knows that it's created a mess in the Western world, that it can't resolve the economic problems. It can't even resolve the social problems. It certainly can't resolve the ideological problems. Right? People need the economy to be rationally controlled. They need socialism. They can't have the anarchy of production. They can't have the chaos of the market continue. Furthermore, people need to know who they are. People need a community to identify with. They need a group to feel that they're part of. They need a family. They need a collective. It's an essential part of the human identity, is knowing who you are. And people need something to believe in. They need to know what they're fighting for in life. They need to be able to determine what is right and what is wrong and by what principles they want to live. Economic liberalism has failed. Social liberalism, to some extent, has failed. Ideological liberalism has absolutely failed. We've got an economic catastrophe in the United States. We've got a social catastrophe in the United States. We've got an ideological catastrophe in the United States. People don't have jobs. People are hungry. People don't know who they are and are committing suicide and getting addicted to drugs. It is impossible for the state to really mobilize any enthusiasm from the people because we're not on the same page anymore as a society. Liberalism is completely failing. It is crashing and burning right now. And so the inevitability that's coming out of this is that illiberalism will triumph. Illiberalism is going to triumph. That is just the reality. Illiberalism is going to triumph. However, the question is, what kind of illiberalism will it be? Right now, they are trying to enact some kind of weird liberal illiberalism, where in order to protect liberalism, we silence anyone who's not a liberal. That's not exactly going to work. Fascism is a form of illiberalism. It is. Fascism is definitely a form of illiberalism. Bonapartist, state authoritarianism, social engineering, all these things are illiberal to some degree or other. But socialism and Marxism is also a form of illiberalism. There are many forms of illiberalism. But the inevitable reality of the course that we are on as a society is that some form of illiberalism is going to triumph. And as I watched that ad on the Scientology advertisement that was on the Super Bowl, and I read all the outrage, all the people calling for that advertisement to be banned because the Church of Scientology is illiberal, which it is, I smiled to myself. I just had to smile to myself. Because at the end of the day, some kind of illiberal order is going to emerge from the chaos spurned by Western liberalism. The question is, what kind of order is it going to be? That's the question. And that's why I'm on here working so hard to educate people about Marxism and socialism. That's why I'm on here trying to explain to people why we need to get to a better world, why dialectical and historical materialism work. And that's why I'm not sitting on here just defending the liberal order from the right-wing opposition. Because the liberal order is going to break. That's pretty much inevitable at this point. There's not a solution to the problems we're facing in the West within the liberal order. The liberal order is going to break. The question is, what replaces the liberal order? I think that what we need is a socialist society, where the banks, factories, and industries, the major centers of economic power, are organized to serve public good. I think the working class, on behalf of all of society, should seize control of the means of production. And I think that growth should be unlimited. I think human reason and rational thinking should be put at the center of the economy. And with human reason, not the anarchy of production dictating what goes on, the wealth of society can greatly expand. We can raise millions from poverty. We can build infrastructure. We can create a situation where everyone has jobs and housing and education. We can move toward a society where no one is exploiting anyone else. We can start to deconstruct all forms of social hierarchy. We can create a world, ultimately, on the basis of each according to their own ability, each according to their needs. But in order to do that, we need to come to the conclusion that the foundation of the problems is economic. Right? Other forms of illiberalism are going to say the foundations of the problem are psychological. They're going to say the foundations of the problem are spiritual. Well, there are spiritual problems. There are psychological problems. But as a materialist, I maintain that those psychological and spiritual problems are the result of economic problems. The economic base is the cause of the crisis we are in. And in order to eradicate and liquidate the crisis, we must liquidate the economic base. We must abolish capitalism if we are going to resolve the crisis of liberalism. And that's all there is to it. And that's why I put out the City Builders and Vandals book. That's why we got the new textbook, We Are City Builders. That's basically, we must abolish the economic base. We must liquidate the economic base of the crisis of liberalism. That's what needs to be done in our time.